Hey friends, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about my new book, Negotiation Made Simple. For the past 20 years, I have helped business people put together important deals, lawyers settle big lawsuits, small business owners grow their business by getting the most value for their product possible. And through this, I've learned a process on how to use negotiation to deliver outstanding deals. This particular book is those 20 years and everything I've learned about negotiation that's packaged in a very practical guide for solving problems, building relationships, and delivering the next deal. I hope you will jump in, buy this book, read this book, put it to work, and in doing so, you will be equipped to get better negotiation outcomes and to get what you want, not only in business, but in life as well. Go purchase Negotiation Made Simple wherever you buy books and use 2024 as an opportunity to take your next step in your negotiation success. Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. I'm really excited about this episode. This is a fun one for me. I've actually had to do a little bit of work in thinking about this episode because it's an area that I'm really digging into as I continue to want to learn and grow as a negotiator. And in this particular episode, we are going to begin a discussion about the human brain and how the human brain has a tremendous impact on the negotiation process, and particularly how it is that humans interact and influence each other. Before, we often thought a lot of this had to do with sociology and psychology, and it still does. There's no doubt that those areas of study play a huge role in negotiation, but now neuroscience is becoming something that is a larger part of the study of negotiation, and people are applying neuroscience in different ways that I find are really interesting and very informative in terms of how, as negotiators, we need to engage the human brain, not only in managing ourselves, but also thinking about how we influence others. There is some really valuable information, and one of the things that I want to do in this episode and on this podcast is to bring that information to you so that you know how it is that you can be more sophisticated in making negotiations simple. So let's jump into our first conversation about the human brain and its impact on the negotiation process. As you think about negotiation, one of the things that's interesting about it is that the science of negotiation really hasn't advanced all that much. There are things about negotiation that when they were discovered or when they were identified and published by academics decades ago, the reality is that much of that has been identified is still very true today. It just hasn't changed. As I've said before, negotiation, the word comes from the Latin root negotiatus. And that Latin root was created hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And the core definition of that Latin root means to carry on business. And so as we think about negotiation and its history, we recognize and we see a scene that is very real even up to this particular moment. And so if we think about back in the day when someone tried to describe what happened in a marketplace, back then it wouldn't have been computers and cars and technology. It would have been bread and livestock and grains and things like that people were trading in the market. But whoever came up with this idea of negotiatus must have observed what was going on to where people would come and they would barter. They would exchange a few loaves of bread for some vegetables or some milk for some meat or whatever the case might be. And in that process, they tried to come up with this idea to say, how do we describe what's happening here between people as they barter and as they negotiate and as they exchange value? And they came up with this idea, negotiatus. And the definition and the way they defined it was this idea of carrying on business. And so as we flash forward all the way to today, that dynamic between humans hasn't changed. Still today, while we're negotiating different things and more sophisticated things and maybe larger valued items, the reality is that process still remains today. And so the people that have studied it and identified things about that process, they've recognized that some of the things that they've identified are timeless and that they just won't change very much. And so what you learned when you read a negotiation book way back in the 80s at the beginning of your career, if you're getting towards the end of your career, you can read another negotiation book. And a lot of what is said in this negotiation book may be very reflective of what you read decades ago. It might be packaged differently. It may have a different formula or some technology that goes around it. I mean, it's advancing, but at the end of the day, the skill is the skill, and it hasn't changed all that much. So the reason that I share that with you is because what I'm interested in and what I want to share with you are the things that I've observed that are changing around negotiation, where the new science and the new learning and the new discoveries are happening. And what I hope that we can do through this podcast is, while we still want to keep it simple, as is true to our name, what I want to begin to do is begin to add some of this new thinking and some of this new science that will allow us to keep it simple, but will also allow us to be on the cutting edge. And so over the next several episodes, we won't do this in a series, but what I want to begin to do is begin thinking about where the science is headed. And what I've observed in terms of some of the biggest advances have to do with how the human brain works. It's thinking about psychology, but now it's even more than psychology. It's neuroscience in terms of really understand how the brain is wired to make decisions. And I think that if those of us as negotiators have a better understanding of that, that will dictate our strategies. That will inform our approaches for how we get deals done and how we engage people to work through problems or to carry business forward. And so that's where I want to spend some conversation, is really thinking about some of these new things. And as we begin to think about the brain, here's what I want to focus on. The brain is a very complex thing. And I would guess that as we look at what we know about the brain today, and we look 10 years, 20 years, 50 years forward, we'll realize that we know only a fraction of what the human brain is capable of. And we have only a very limited understanding of how it truly operates. Although over the past decade or so, I think there has been some very significant advances in terms of understanding the human brain, understanding how the brain reacts to stimuli from the world, and how that is actually, in some cases, changing our brain and changing the way it works and how we think. So let's jump into this conversation a little bit about the human brain. Remember, I'm an expert on negotiation. I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. I am not a neuroscientist. And so I am going to provide some introductory ideas here. And then hopefully through guests, hopefully through some more study on my part, I can share with you more and more. But by no means is this meant to be comprehensive at this stage in terms of understanding. But as I study it and as I learn more about it, there are some things that I think are worth sharing that I find very interesting, and I'm excited to share with you. And so the two elements about the human brain that I have found most interesting and most relevant to the conversation about negotiation is that the human brain is wired to make shortcuts. And the human brain, both in the conscious and the subconscious parts of our brain, there is bias. And it's bias that we almost can't even control. It's literally kind of built in. And so if we are going to be really savvy in terms of how we engage people, and we are going to be really sophisticated in how we manage ourselves, we have to have an understanding of how it is that our brain makes shortcuts and the biases that get built into our brain and how it functions. And so the brain, there's so much information that the brain has to process every single day. Experts say that the brain makes about 35,000 decisions a day. Think about that. No wonder you're exhausted at night. Your brain has made 35,000 decisions. And because of all of the inputs that are coming in, because of all the work the brain does to then have to make decisions as a result of those inputs, what you're left with is you're left with a brain that is looking to make shortcuts. And there's lots of neuroscience that has looked into how it is that the brain makes shortcuts. Some of the most interesting presentations of the brain, though, have not come from neuroscientists. A lot of what I'm going to share with you today, I actually learned from a fellow attorney, a friend of mine named Mark Lanier, who has studied this at depth and has taken this understanding of the brain and has applied it to the practice of law, much of which is negotiation. And so some of the ideas I've learned from Mark, who has studied this at more in depth, but he's inspired me in terms of my study of the brain and how it impacts negotiation. And so as we think about some of these shortcuts, I want to just share a couple of them with you. We're not going to get into all of them. There's way too many to cover in one episode. But one of the things that I found was really interesting was one of the shortcuts and one of the ways that our brain makes shortcuts is through bias. And it creates biases. And as a result of that, that impacts how we make decisions, but also how we see the world. And so let me go to a popular one that I think a lot of us are aware of. But then let's think about this in the context of negotiation. This bias is confirmation bias. There was a very famous article by Raymond Nickerson back in 1998 on confirmation bias. And essentially what confirmation bias is says that all you will hear is what you already believe. And so think about that for just a second. As you're listening, as you're inputting these thousands and thousands of inputs every single day, your brain is picking up on what affirms what you already believe. And your brain is working to constantly kind of build that case. And as a result of it, the brain picks up on the things that it hears and the things that it sees that connects with an idea or a thought or a pattern that already exists in your brain. And because there's that connectivity, the brain pays attention to that. Well, one of the things we have to recognize that's really interesting is that the brain then, for things that don't affirm things that we already believe or patterns that we already see or perceive, what the brain will do is it will ignore other stuff. And so as a result of that, when we find ourselves engaged in negotiation, there are moments where we will have to work particularly hard to truly listen and understand the perspective of the other side, because that may not be confirmation of what we already believe. That may be totally new information. It may be more difficult for our brain to truly understand that, because that may be a perspective that is completely foreign to us or one that we totally disagree with. And so as a result, and this is no criticism of anyone, this is just how the brain works. The brain is inclined to dismiss that idea or to disregard that idea, or to push that idea to the side because it doesn't play into what scholars have identified as confirmation bias. Now, as negotiators, we want to be very careful with that because we want to make sure that, especially as we're in a cooperative approach to a negotiation, that we don't dismiss too quickly the ideas of others because they're not connecting with something or a preconception that our brain already has. And so it's really critical that we pay attention to where we have and where we're looking for confirmation bias. Now, on the flip side of this, we also have to think about the other side of communication. And so as we're working with people and as we're trying to put deals together with people and resolve problems with people, we also have to be aware of how confirmation bias works in their minds. And we've got to recognize that one of the things that as negotiators we might have to overcome in the context of our negotiation is a confirmation bias that exists in the other person. And so, for example, if we find ourselves in a sales negotiation, there may be confirmation bias as to a particular vendor providing more value and a better product than what you and your company might provide. And so you have this person who is sitting across the table that you're trying to convince to do business with you, and yet the whole time what they're doing is they're processing your information in light of the incumbent and the experience that they are having with the incumbent provider. And so what they're looking for is information that you share that would say, yes, see, that proves that the incumbent provider is the right way to go because your company doesn't do that, or because you're more expensive than they are. And so notice right here, one of the things in order to get that deal, in order to make that happen, that you're going to have to overcome is you're going to have to overcome the confirmation bias that exists in the other person. Now, what happens is as things become more important, as you have the consequences of the negotiation that are escalated, people, as the stakes grow higher, they are going to lock in more strongly to the confirmation bias that already exists in their minds. And so by elevating the importance of something, by talking about how critical this is or that, that's one thing to recognize, is that by doing so, you will just elevate the strength of the confirmation bias that already exists. And so the big question becomes, okay, how is it that I can overcome the confirmation bias? You've convinced me, John, that there is something to this. Now, what do I do about it? Well, let me share with you a couple of different ideas that I think can be helpful. First is acknowledge it. To just be real with people and say, listen, I understand that you've done business with this company for a long time. And I'm sure that for that period of time, they've served you very, very well. Let's talk about those areas where they've served you well and get those out on the table so that the mind is not constantly trying to just go back to those things, but instead you've invited those things to come out onto the table. What that will do is that will give you then the opportunity to explore some of the things, and it will free their mind to explore some things that maybe aren't as positive or maybe were more difficult in terms of that relationship, and to put the mind in a position to where it's not trying to just confirm what it already believes, but to put someone's mind in a position to where that has already been accomplished. And now it opens the mind to be able to consider some of the negative challenges that also exist, and then to more objectively be able to look at an alternative. And so an interesting little trick there that seems counterintuitive, but if we know how the mind works and we understand that more fully, then we're at a place to where we can act more strategically to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Now, we'll know because we'll hear it in people's language. We'll see it in terms of how they tell a story or how they talk about an experience in terms of where the confirmation bias is. Oftentimes, you can identify it in terms of things that they just mentioned over and over and over and over again. That's how the mind continues to reinforce this confirmation bias, is by constantly revisiting it. And so you'll be able to pick up on these areas where you say, man, I got a really strong confirmation bias going on over here. Or same with us, when your mind just goes back to the same fact or the same dynamic or the same thing, you can pick up on the fact that within your own mind, a confirmation bias has been built, and you will have to be very intentional about managing it accordingly. The other thing that I think can be helpful in overcoming confirmation bias is to creating simplicity for people. So this goes back to the title of this podcast and the title of my book, Negotiation Made Simple. And one of the ways in which you can make negotiation simple is by being intentional to do just that, to make it simple. Now, here is the value of simplicity, okay? Is because another shortcut of our brain is this thing that's called cognitive ease. Cognitive ease basically says that people tend to believe that which is easy to understand. And they're more likely to believe something as true if it's an easy to understand statement. And so marketing has used this like crazy, to where marketers say, like, you got to be able to explain your company in one sentence, or you got to have a tagline that's no more than 3 words that reflects what your company is all about. Or if we're talking about it in the political dynamic, you got to have a slogan, you got to have a phrase that people will associate with your candidacy that is easy for them to understand what you and you are all about. And so if just for a couple of examples, I'll use one from both parties because I don't want to get criticized for being biased one way or another. But Barack Obama, his campaign, the slogan was, "Yes, we can." Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Then you have Donald Trump come along a few years later, and his slogan is "Make America Great Again." Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And so here, regardless of on what side of the aisle you're on, if you can develop this cognitive ease in terms of making it easy for someone's mind to grasp something, then you're making progress in terms of overcoming any confirmation bias that exists that may work against you, or being able to impact that in some way. One of the things I forgot to mention real quickly about confirmation bias is I talked a little bit about how to overcome it, but one of the interesting things too is it's also our biggest tool. It can be our biggest friend, to where if we know that we've got confirmation bias that was working for us, then what we need to do in that case is just to affirm it again and again and again, and to constantly be putting that in front of someone so that we can just reinforce that bias that works for us. And so these ideas, they work for us and against us. And so as we think about cognitive ease, another way in which the mind can grasp things is, number one, it's just easy to understand, but number two, it's fun and it's interesting. And so think about that in terms of the context of negotiation and the environment in which you might do a negotiation, or the way in which you might do a negotiation. The more or the less painful that it can be, the more fun that it can be, it is easier for the mind to then engage and to get its mind around what it is you are trying to convince the other person of, or the deal that you're trying to get them to say yes to. Another way to overcome it is to find other things that are familiar to the mind. And so you might look for things and say, okay, I've got a confirmation bias I've got to overcome over here. I want to make this really simple. How do I make it simple? Well, let me maybe do an analogy of something that they really do understand. And by creating this analogy of something that the other side can easily attach onto and fully understands, again, that creates an easy way for the mind to shift in a different direction, and for people to be able to hear, and people be able to listen, and people be able to understand the point that you're making by doing it through something with which they are very familiar with. And so this is where visuals and demonstratives and these kinds of things become very, very valuable, is to simply say, hey, let me, forget trying to convince you. Let me just show you this real quick. Like, just take a look at this picture. And so many times what I will do when I'm kind of working these things out is I will use a whiteboard. And I will use a whiteboard because it helps me organize a little bit, but it helps people engage the visual part of their mind. And sometimes the path through the visual part of the mind is an easier path for people to learn and people to understand than just talking to them and having them use the more auditory part of their mind. And so when you start thinking about this, you're sitting here going like, John, this is becoming really, really complex. And the answer is, you're right, it is. But the opportunity here is, if we think strategically and carefully about how it is that we try to connect with the mind of someone else, the way and the means in which we do that are actually really quite simple. And so having the understanding of, I've got a visual person and I need to articulate this visually, that is very sophisticated. To be wise enough and savvy enough to be able to understand that that's what's needed to get the deal done and to convince the other side to say yes. But then the idea of coming up with a visual, that may not be very hard at all. That's really simple. And so it could be something as simple as saying, here, I want you to take a look at this picture. What do you see in this picture? Well, what you see, that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. And now all of a sudden, through a picture, you have just communicated a very powerful point. So we're making things a bit more sophisticated in terms of how the mind works. But I think what we're doing is we're understanding the ways and the areas in which we can do some very simple things that will cause us to be much more effective as negotiators. Now, in this conversation, I have not even scratched the surface. And so you can sit there and be like, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Absolutely. There is so much more to this conversation, but I hope that this is a start in terms of convincing you that doing a little bit of research and doing a little bit of thinking about the brain and exposing yourself to some of this new information, some of this neuroscience that we have about the brain now, this, I think, can help you become a much better negotiator. It can provide you with tremendous insight in terms of how to work with people, how to engage people, how to most effectively communicate with people, and then ultimately how it is that we influence people in the negotiation process. So consider this just an opening word, an opening thought. And I'll look forward to, in the coming months, as I continue to study and as I continue to learn, coming back and sharing more about this. And I'm excited too about having some guests on that know much more about this than I do, and having some conversations with them about how we can take all of this new information and this new research and apply it to ourselves as negotiators. Well, I certainly hope you're intrigued. I hope you're intrigued by this association between the study of the human brain, neuroscience, psychology, social psychology, all of these areas of study that look at how people make decisions, that look at how people view the world, and how that applies to negotiation. I am beginning to see more and more connectivity between those areas of study and the negotiation process. And this conversation is just the first of what I hope is many. It's certainly just absolutely just dabbling in the waters here in terms of all of the information out there that exists. But I think even in this conversation, there are a few valuable nuggets that you want to take away in terms of thinking about when you're negotiating, how do you create cognitive ease? How do you create different tools that trigger different parts of someone's mind so they might consider something differently? How is it that you can find points of familiarity with people to where because of that, their mind can be saved to think differently and not just looking to affirm the biases that exist? So a couple of great ideas here that I think can be really valuable to you as you look to win the day and to manage your negotiation adventures. I hope you'll stay with us and listen to the upcoming episodes as we dig into this issue and many others around negotiation. Thanks for listening, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Negotiation Made Simple.